This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
There has been a complaint that was filed with the Competition Bureau. And this complaint was put forward by News Media Canada, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, and the CBC. And this complaint has to do with Bill C18 and the fact that Meta has determined that they are no longer carrying news links. Now, they made this clear well before the legislation was passed that this would be the decision that they would make in response to the legislation. However, these outlets that I've just listed, or unions, are now complaining that, and I'll quote, by refusing to negotiate with Canadian news organizations in good faith for the access of Canadian news content on Meta's platforms, and by blocking the news content on the platforms, Meta is denying Canadian news organizations fair compensation for their content, leaving them with limited resources to compete effectively in the news publishing market. This last phrase here, leaving them without the adequate resources to compete in the news market, would say that Meta served as a vehicle or a platform by which these news sources were being shared. That vehicle is no longer provided, and these news outlets then are saying it's hurting them. But the whole premise of Bill C18 was on the fact that the news outlets were actually providing the value, and Meta needed to pay them. In this, it seems that they're making an admission that actually the benefit was found in Meta being the vehicle. Do you care to comment on this further and expand on it?
Well, sure. I think that, as many pointed out, the reality is that there were great benefits that came to the publishers from social media and from search. Indeed, that was the basis upon which, in many respects, this took place for a very long period of time. And frankly, what we have seen in the aftermath of the legislation taking effect in June, I think, really confirms that we have seen, and I don't think it can be understated, real harm with news entities talking about lost traffic in the range of 30%. There are some news outlets that have stopped their services effectively or suspended their operations altogether. And I think particularly notably, there has been real harm from an investment perspective in this country. We've had a number of entities come forward to say that in the current environment, given the way the legislation has been structured, investing in news in Canada, given that legislation, just isn't something people are apt to do given that environment. So I think it's caused real harm based on this odd conception that somehow driving free traffic to publishers, which was clearly of value, we now see just how much it was worth, somehow required compensation, which at the end of the day was all about creating mandated payments for links, which is why I know myself and many others were deeply troubled by the foundational elements in the legislation.
Thank you, Dr. Geis. I want to follow up on something else that you said, and it's somewhat related. Now, we know that the big broadcasters, Rogers, Bell, CBC, have a lot to gain from Bill C18, potentially. However, we also know that those that would be the new and up-and-coming platforms that are based online, which Ms. Hefner referred to as not actual news outlets, I would contend otherwise. I believe that they're legitimate. They've actually been hurt significantly by this legislation. And to your point that you raised in your opening remarks, many of them have made the determination to not hire more employees because they know that they might be put out of business potentially by this legislation. In your estimation, why would, it's not fair to ask why. I can't ask you to speculate, but I guess I'm just curious. Maybe you could expand a little bit on Bill C18 was put out by the minister at the time, Minister Rodriguez, as something that was meant to benefit the little guy. It was meant to benefit the local newspapers, the ethnic media, the local media source, et cetera, which many of these exist online. Why did it end up in a place where it is benefiting the big broadcasters?
Okay. I guess I'd respond in a couple of ways. First, it ends up benefiting primarily the large broadcasters. The parliamentary budget officer tells us 75% of the money goes to the broadcasters, radio and television, largely based on the way it was structured. It went outside of the QCJO framework that we have around the labor journalism tax credit, which ensured that broadcasters, which are dominated by a handful of large players in Canada, would be the major the major beneficiaries. Personally, I think it was a mistake. I think that, at a minimum, if the goal was to support the core, what we would think of as newspapers or digital publishers, and that's where the focus of the legislation ought to have been. But I think there is an answer to your why. And I have to say, I think one part of the answer to the why is that many of the online news organizations weren't heard. They were oftentimes not given opportunities, or when they were, whether at this committee or frankly at the Senate, at times they were disrespected. I can recall one of the largest of the independents that's operating in many Ontario communities, Village Media, appeared before the Senate. One of the questions that their CEO, Jeff Elgie, was asked by Senator Harder was, aren't you happy to see newspapers closing, because then you can scoop up some of the staff and enter into these new markets? The idea that online news entities somehow celebrate or welcome the prospect of the challenges that are being faced, I think such a total misread of where things are at. And so what we've seen in the recent months is everyone from Village Media to Narcity to a whole range of players basically screaming, this is causing enormous harm, and saying at a minimum, surely we need some sort of deal with Google, because otherwise the effects will be catastrophic, which one would hope will ultimately lead everybody to find some kind of compromise on this. But the harm here has been very, very real, and it was not just predictable, but it was predicted.
Thank you, Mr. Geist.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start with Dr. Geist. So, Dr. Geist, you may have seen some of my interventions here at committee on C18, where I did start by pointing out to the Minister of Heritage what had happened in Australia when Meta blocked news content, and asked him what actions he was going to take to make sure that didn't happen in Canada. And he said it was a simple business decision. And so when Meta and Google were here, I asked them if C18 is passed in its current form, and if the government makes you pay for people to share news links, would it be a reasonable business decision to decide not to do that because you'd have to pay? And they both said that it was. So I was not surprised when this result happened, although the Liberals and NDP seem to be shocked and surprised. It looks like it's had very negative impacts on small and local businesses, which was the whole point of trying to have C18 protect local small news outlets. So were you surprised, and what do you think the impacts have been?
Thanks for the question. No, I wasn't surprised. I appeared before this committee a couple of times on C18, and I thought that if you understood the business model that existed, and we've heard a lot of the negative aspects of the business model, which is why I think there is a role to play for regulation when it comes to some kind of the harms that have been articulated. But that wasn't what C18 was about. If you understood the business model of trying, as we've heard, to keep people on the platform and capture information and deliver ads to them, the idea that news content was something they couldn't live without never made much sense. I mean, the reality is that's the sort of content that actually sends people away off the site. And so given what had been taking place, it seemed to me that this was likely to occur. I also have to say, sometimes it felt as if people didn't fully think through some of the implications. I mean, with all respect, it was this committee that established a specific exception for campus broadcasters to include them in the legislation. And we just heard today that, well, campus news isn't included. Literally, this committee included it within one of its amendments so that they would be eligible under the system. And so it's also this committee that passed legislation that said all news, facilitating access to all news, whether in Canada or anywhere, brings you within the scope of being a digital news intermediary. You could have made the choice to say only that news that's from a qualified Canadian journalism organization, only those who qualify for payments, which actually would have excluded some of these other entities and would have excluded many of the foreign entities. But that wasn't the choice that was made. And so it seems to me these were the choices made in the legislation, and the outcomes were pretty predictable.
Thank you. It appears that there are even more harms coming from the way C18 was implemented than expected. You may have seen the Substack from my colleague Michelle Rempel-Garner yesterday, where she expressed concern about how the rollout of C18 was going to impact especially diasporas and ethnic small media. Could you comment on what you think the impacts have been of C18 on them?
Yeah, I'm actually, with your permission, I'd like to expand that, not just to C18, but C11 as well. one of the real concerns with the legislative approach that this committee, that the legislation has taken on both the Streaming Act and on the News Act, has been to have significant negative implications for access to foreign content for diaspora communities. I think one of the real fears of what we're seeing play out at the CRTC is the likelihood, with the increased cost of registration, but even more than registration, actual costs of regulation, could well lead many foreign streaming services to simply block the Canadian market because it doesn't become economic anymore, and it's particularly those communities that may be most directly affected. Same is true on the news side. So yes, this was a likely outcome. And again, I'm going to come back to my opening remarks to emphasize, if you weren't listening to these players, if you decided all you needed to do was by and large listen to News Media Canada and a few other cheerleaders, then you'd miss that large story.
Let's go there for a minute. You said that News Media Canada was the biggest lobbyist on this bill, and that they got everything that they wanted. And we saw immediately after C18 was passed, Bell Media decided to shut down over 1,200 news outlets that were local. Metro followed suit. And so it looks at the end of the day that C18 utterly failed to meet its objective, and rather lobbyists and the CBC and Bell and Rogers ended up with the lion's share of the taxpayers' money. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'd say nobody's ended up with anything right now. And, there is certainly some hope that there may be a deal with Google. And if there is one, then there is some revenue. But I have to say that given what seems to be a permanent position where Facebook and Meta and Instagram will not be coming back into the news market under this current environment, it's going to be very hard to make up the damage that's been caused by this legislation already, which I think helps explain what we just saw in the fall economic statement, which was the $129 million, supplementing and more than doubling what's available per journalist as part of the labor journalism tax credit.
Thank you.